I'm going to be giving you a brief presentation on documentation. I've got this inserted into the week when we're talking about professional practice because documentation is an important part of that. And many of you will have experience with documentation because you've worked in settings where you had to record things about the clients you were seeing. I put this in though because some of you may appreciate having a slightly more formal resource about this. And for your case analysis assignment, I'm actually going to ask you to give me the case study first in a format that's consistent with what I'll be describing here. So you have all of the PowerPoint slides. I'm not going to speak to each of the PowerPoint slides, but I'm just going to give you a brief overview here, and then you can also review those at your leisure. Things we'll be looking at are basic expectations for documentation and then the types of documentation that we generally do in social work. Okay, so what should we be recording? Well, the first thing we need to, of course, establish is that there are reasons why we have to document. And that seems like a basic thing, but if you're in practice long enough, you probably have had or heard a story about somebody who was seeing a client for months or years, and then something happened where they needed to see the client files and there was nothing there, and it's a big problem, right? So it's very important that we create this documentation, partly because there's just an accountability around that, policy requirements, legal requirements, but also I think it's important to remember that this is how we often represent our clients to other people, and that's where we construct a narrative of the work that we're doing together with them. So it's very important to create that narrative in a way that's respectful and that communicates effectively and that represents their interests well. So that's why it's always worth, first of all, documenting, but documenting effectively. Some of the legal issues around documentation that you want to bear in mind is that your client files can be subpoenaed. You can be called into court and told that you have to talk about the content of your notes, and that can include any notes that you take about your clients. You may not think it's part of the client file, but if it's about your client, it can be subpoenaed. And of course, clients have the rights to read their own files, and it's good to think about, am I recording things in a way that I feel is respectful to my client, that I would be okay with my client seeing and my supervisor seeing and other people. And then also, while you may think that everything in the kitchen sink is supposed to go into your files, that's not actually true. FIPA has some pretty clear rules about what's considered private information. Your agency is probably going to have some expectations around what should be going into clients' files, and so it's important to know what these things are and important to know about your agency's policies around documentation. And that's why one of the first things you'll do when you go into any setting, whether that's your practicum or a job, is you're going to be learning about what their documentation expectations are. This is just some stuff from the OCSSW, so OCSSW, that's a mouthful. So that's the provincial body here for social workers. You can look at this at your leisure, but I don't think there's going to be anything here that surprises you. Some of the general guidelines that we want to talk about and you want to be talking about in your settings is what do we include and what do we exclude from client files? What kind of language do we use? How do we use terminology? What's considered to be shared terminology? How are we making sure that we document in a timely manner so that you're not like doing a month's documentation all at once, but you're documenting in a way that keeps it accurate and timely? And then also who has access to records. A client actually should know exactly who has access to their records. So if the whole team has access, then you should tell your client, yes, the whole team's going to have access. But there certainly should be people in the setting that don't have access, and this is especially important, I suppose, in settings where where there are dual relationships, where there are people who may be connected to the clients in other ways. So you want to be thinking very clearly about who has access to records. Okay, and then finally, confidentiality, which we'll talk about a lot in this course, is of course important in documentation. There are few things that are exceptions in terms of, confidentiality, and like I said, we'll talk about this more, but most of you will probably know that, some of the things that you can break confidentially around and should break confidentially confidentiality around are issues like finding out about child abuse or neglect, finding out about a suicide intent, plan, or attempt, and also if you find out that somebody plans harm or violence to somebody else. And this is again one of those issues you want to discuss in your agency to find out what policies they have about what you would do if any of those things come up. Okay, I'm going to skip that one. I want to mention falsifying records. People always think, well, gee, of course I'm not going to falsify records, but things like backdating them or putting things into the files because you think you're going to do them, then later you didn't do them, and there it is in the file, that's a huge problem. So you want to make sure that the only things that go into your records are things that have actually happened, right? You can always go back later and say that you had to add something after the fact because you couldn't record it at the time, but you should not have anything in that file that didn't happen. And you'll see here that usually it is frowned upon to be erasing files or whiting out things. You should, if there's an error in your files, you're supposed to indicate it's an error and then correct it. Okay, so let's talk about types of documentation. This is really the meat and potatoes here. So what goes into a client file? What kind of things do we expect to see if we're looking at a client file? Well, it's a long list here, but basically it is the story of who your client is and what their experience has been with you or with the agency that you work at. So you see there's the name of the counselor, there's stuff about the client themselves, other people in their lives, what kind of meetings you've been having, who else is involved, etc., etc., etc. So this is sort of a list of the kinds of things you'd expect to find in a client file, and importantly, they should all be in the same place. It is not helpful to somebody who's trying to come afterwards if they cannot find information because it's located in 5 different places in your office or in your agency, right? So all of this stuff should be in a single client file. Some of the important stages for documentation is at intake, when somebody's first referred to you or when they self-refer themselves. Another stage is when you do the actual assessment to figure out what's going to be happening with them in your agency. And then along the way, as you are monitoring and documenting the progress that you make with the client, and then finally when you terminate with them. So at an intake and referral, there are going to be different ways that different formats that people have for this, and usually there's actually a template that you're probably that you're filling in. The kind of general information that you're going to see is identifying information about the client and what brings them to you, so that's the referral information, the kind of problems that are being identified, and any information you have about client requests or preferences. The thing about intake documentation is that it's fairly brief, but it should at the very least give you the information that you need in order to do triage. So I use the term triage because I worked in a medical setting. I'm sure there's other and better language for this. But basically you want the information in the intake to give some indication of the urgency of this person's situation. Do they need to be seen right away? Can you make an appointment for them a week from today? You know, whatever is taken down in that first contact should give you some indication and should indicate what the plan is next, right? And then the information that's collected during that interaction should go to the person who's going to meet with them when they come into your service. The next thing that's going to happen is probably some kind of an assessment. So this is when you tell what is at that point the whole story of this client. So, you know, who are they? What's happened to them in the past? What's going on with them right now? What do they have to say about that? What do other people have to say about that? What kind of issues are they presenting with now? What are we talking about in terms of what their needs are and what other people are recommending? I think it's very important to be able to talk about strengths and resources that clients have. So I have here past successes and exceptions. So exceptions referring to times when things were going well as opposed to now when obviously things probably aren't going as well. Another thing that you want to cover under strengths and resources is things like, you know, who are the support people that they have in their life, and what are the things that they have going for them in terms of their attitudes or their confidence or whatever, you know, so psychologically, socially, you know, spiritually, culturally, what kind of strengths and resources can we talk about? Because that's a very important part of thinking about, you know, what can we draw on to help this client who's coming to us with some kind of a need. And it's also part of creating a holistic narrative of who this person is. And then hopefully, ideally, what should come out of that assessment is some kind of a plan that, having looked at all of these things, you have an idea of what is most important to the client, what is most important to, I guess, the other people in their lives, what is feasible in terms of moving ahead with whatever problem they've got, and you will be able to delineate some kind of a plan. Okay, so one of the things that some people wonder about is formulation. And formulation is one of those things that gets taught in social work. I'm not sure how much it still gets taught in social work, but certainly it's a way that goes it's a practice that goes very deep in the profession in terms of being able to provide some kind of a theoretically informed explanation of what's going on with the client. So basically, a formulation is just a summary of the client situation where you are addressing these areas that I have here: the predisposing stuff, what happened in the past; the precipitating stuff, what brings them to you now; the perpetuating stuff, what's going on right now that sort of keeps the problem going; and then what's protective, which brings us back to those strengths and resources. And you should recognize this in terms of thinking about biopsychosocial and spiritual assessments, right? A biopsychosocial spiritual perspective gets you thinking about the client in all these different areas. And what the formulation asks you to do is to think about this client over time, where they've come from, where they are now, and what's ahead of them in terms of what's perpetuating and what's protective. So that's basically what these 4Ps are about. I put it in there in case it ever comes up for you, but I think this is something that's actually not being used as much because it's very discipline specific, and most of us are working in environments that are multidisciplinary. But it's there, and if you want to know more about it, I can certainly provide resources on it. So the assessment, like I said, is this overall story of who the client is. It should be a place that you can look very quickly to know what's going on with somebody and what the goals they are that they have and what kind of plans that they're making for the future, and who is also going to be involved with them. And an assessment is something that's always ongoing. I mean, as you get new information and you get a deeper understanding of this person, as things change and some of the things that are happening biopsychosocially and spiritually change, you're going to need to update your assessment. So at some point, you want to think about, when do I look at that assessment again and maybe update it? Is it because something has changed? Is it because there's going to be a change in workers? Is it because there's a change in, there's just like a regular schedule for reassessment? And these are the kinds of things that get decided within agency specifically. But that's basically, you want to have something on the file that really summarizes the client situation, and that's generally what we think of the assessment doing. Some things you may want to think about, and there aren't easy answers to these questions, or not simple answers to these questions anyway. What kind of things do you want to put in your assessment? What kind of things do you leave out? And that's true for progress notes, which we'll be talking about next too. So I look at this list of things: race, gender, sexuality, cultural information, trauma histories, illegal activities. They all seem like things to me that it would be important to include in my documentation. That said, though, you can think of circumstances where maybe it wouldn't be that important, and that might be if it might depend on the kind of services that you're providing. It may be that to the client it's not important and they don't want it documented, and if it's not essential, you don't need to put it in there. I think the one that people find the most tricky is involvement in illegal activity, because they're worried about, if I put down something, if I know my client's involved in illegal activity and I put it in my files, does that mean I have to do something about it? Or can I be in some kind of trouble later because I didn't report it? And again, these are the kinds of things that you need to discuss in your setting and discuss with a supervisor, because there aren't simple answers to what to do in a situation like that. Okay, so I'm not going to go into that. I'm going to take a break here, and you can sort of reflect on that, and next we'll be talking about progress notes.